So, the finals wrapped up a little over 2 weeks ago, but it feels like it's been months. For anyone who may have been on the lookout for that quality Hoops Hour content, I am sorry, I've been lacking. Ironically, I stepped away from my desk and went on vacation the day after Game 5, and I've been slow to get back into things. Nonetheless, with the finals over and a new champion having been crowned, the summer has started and the NBA offseason is underway. I'm going to bounce around the league talking about some of the crazy moves that have already gone down. Number one on that list, of course, being the blockbuster deal to send Bradley Beal to the Phoenix Suns, establishing a new big three with Devin Booker and Kevin Durant. Full trade details are going to be on the screen now. I really don't know what to say about this trade. For the Wizards, I'm impressed they offloaded one of the craziest contracts in the NBA, and I'm excited for them to be embarking on their post-Beal journey. I'll talk about Washington more later on in this video, but as for the Suns, I feel a bit disappointed because I really thought this offseason was about fleshing out their roster to become a real contender, and they've just made that almost impossible. Not only are they taking on one of the biggest contracts in the league, they're doing so while already being tied up in almost $112 million spread across Devin Booker, Kevin Durant, and DeAndre Ayton, just for next season. Add in Beal, and that's a combined salary of almost $160 million for 4 players. That's more than the entire roster's salary cap going into next season for less than a starting 5. It has the Suns flirting with the luxury tax line, which means anything beyond that, they'll have to pay additional penalties. And with the new bargaining agreement that goes into effect on July 1st, the NBA is going to be cracking down on teams who are reckless spenders harder than they ever have before. That leaves the Suns less than $10 million to flush out a competent roster, giving them very few options. The glaring solution to partially aiding this conundrum is to trade DeAndre Ayton, someone who will be earning just under $32.5 million in the 2023-2024 season. The Suns have done more than just feel out interest for him on the market. They're fully trying to find a deal for him, so at this point a DeAndre Ayton trade seems inevitable, and it's more about when and where. The last thing I'll say on all this Sun stuff is going back to Bradley Beal, and another reason I'm not a fan of this trade for Phoenix beyond just the finances. I strongly feel like Beal's addition to this team is a redundancy and isn't addressing the actual on-court issues this team faced. In this year's playoffs, we saw Devin Booker and KD torch opponents' defense and combine for well over 60 points a game. Bradley Beal might be raising the offensive ceiling of this team a little bit higher, but that really wasn't the issue that needed to be addressed, and his presence just gives Phoenix a more extreme version of the problem they already had. They're a super talented team that isn't very dynamic and can't get stops. Yes, Beal is one of the better scorers in the league, but he's not an amazing playmaker or a terrific defender, and most importantly, he overlaps with the other 2 stars. This team needs defense, shooters, roll men. The Suns have a guard, and a really tall guard. There's a great video by Rusty Buckets talking about redundancy and the skills of co-stars, so I definitely recommend watching that if you want to hear more, but essentially teams with star players that do the same things can only really go so far. Look at Jason Tatum and Jaylen Brown, 2 of the most talented and versatile players in the NBA, minus Jaylen's left hand. With how good they are and how flushed out the rest of the Celtics roster has been, there's almost no excuses for why they didn't win the championship in 2022 or why they came up short of the finals this year. But they did, because co-stars need to be able to play off of one another and fill the gaps in each other's games if they want to become a lethal, perfectly synced pair. Think no further than Kobe and Shaq, or Jamal Murray and Nikola Jokic. Tatum and Brown are the same player, one's just not as good as the other. They don't have games that complement each other, so when one or both go cold, they can't find ways to uplift the other or just generally offer something different. Getting back to my original point, I'm sure you can see now if you didn't already, I don't believe Book, KD, and Beal can ultimately form something transcendent since their skills are practically the same. Obviously, they're not carbon copy clones of one another, so I don't want to stress this point too hard, and I know if these 3 play on the floor at the same time, there are going to be moments of awe based off of the sheer talent and offensive ability they have. I just think of this trio as the only thing the Suns have to turn to make things happen. They'll come up short against a much more well-rounded and competent team. I won't count them out completely yet because there are a few pieces they can trade to make themselves into a slightly deeper roster, and luckily Ayton's replacement only needs to be halfway decent it seems, so it shouldn't be too hard to find someone on less money, but regardless, I'm not a big fan of this trade by the Suns. Keeping it going, I've got to talk about the trade that broke my brain the most so far, and I'm really surprised isn't being talked about more. Chris Paul is a Golden State Warrior. Let's run through a few things. It seems like Chris Paul is expected to be in the starting lineup and not come off of the bench to lead a second unit. That would most likely give the Warriors a starting five of Chris Paul as the 1 with Steph Curry as the shooting guard, Klay Thompson at the 3 with Andrew Wiggins as the power forward, and then Draymond Green at the 5, assuming Draymond is still around. This lineup is deadly without a doubt, but there are some problems that need to be addressed. First, with the strong suits, the playmaking on this team is insane. I mean, Chris Paul, Steph, and Draymond, these passes will be beautiful. Additionally, Chris Paul might not be an elite three-point shooter, but he's about to get the most open looks of his entire career, so hopefully he's able to take advantage. And on top of that, the defensive intelligence of Chris Paul and Draymond Green is remarkable, and would certainly make up for the fact that the defensive personnel isn't as well-rounded as the offense is. As for my concerns, the first I want to address is their size, arguably the most glaring issue. Even if their overall IQ can surmount some of the defensive shortcomings this team will have, they just aren't that big. If the biggest guys in your lineup are Draymond and Wiggins in the 6'6" and 6'7" range, a dominant interior team is going to pick them apart, just like we saw in their Lakers series this year. They've got Looney when they want to play a more traditional big, but then you have to hedge for whatever losses you might take when you can't run your go-to lineup on the floor. Other than that, my other worry for this team is just the overall fit of CP3, which I think comes with a few questions. While he is undeniably one of the greatest guards to ever play the game, Chris Paul is 38 years old and has an extensive injury history. Even if he's an incredibly smart defender and plays beyond what an average 6-foot guard can do on that end, can his body really keep up enough to be a leader defensively like he'd need to be? Also, there's the issue of playstyle, because the Warriors define motion offense, while Chris Paul plays a more methodical style where he controls the ball and sets the tempo of the game. That's clearly going to conflict with the way the Warriors run their actions, and he's going to have to learn to play off ball, and I can't confidently say the old dog will learn new tricks. No offense, CP. Overall, this acquisition by the Warriors is super interesting. I don't know if CP3 had been secretly cooking this one up in the back or what, but either way, it's just a really weird fit with a high upside, so I'm very excited to see this one play out. One of the biggest upsides for Golden State in the Chris Paul trade was in how little they gave up to get him. That might sound like a hot take, it might not. That's entirely dependent on your disposition towards Jordan Poole. I myself am not too hot on the guy. He was electric in the 2022 playoffs and undeniably a big part of that championship run for the Warriors, but he's never been a particularly efficient player, so that felt more like an outlier than it did a natural progression for him. And what do you know? Lo and behold, he was kinda ass this season. He did up his averages a bit, but he was scoring just 20 points a game on almost 16 shots. And on top of that, his turnovers also increased. I cringed when Golden State paid him the kind of money they did last year, but it was kind of a tough position for them coming off a championship title. You obviously want to invest in the young player who was just outstanding for you, but that requires a leap of faith in hoping that what you saw wasn't a fluke and he'll actually keep growing. Ultimately, you can never know, and it wasn't necessarily the wrong call for them to pay Jordan Poole. It's just, they gave him almost $130 million over 4 years. That seems a bit overkill. I don't want to bash on Jordan Poole too much. He's not really my kind of player because when he's on, he looks like the second coming of Steph Curry, and when he's not, you can smell the hot garbage through the TV screen. But efficiency and lack of many other skills aside, JP in Washington does give us the opportunity to see what kind of player he can truly be. When Steph was out of the lineup, Poole's averages last season were actually quite comparable to some of the premier guards in the league, albeit still not on great shooting splits and with high turnovers. But it's clear he's immensely talented offensively speaking, and while he's slowly phasing out of the young enough to give the benefit of the doubt range, he does still have a lot of time to improve and become a more consistent scorer. It's also possible that Poole's playstyle isn't 100% conducive to the Warriors system, and that he might thrive on a team that allows him to control the pace and go into isolation more. Given the fact that the Wizards roster will essentially be full of nobodies, and with the keys to the team presumably being his, maybe Jordan Poole will become one of the better guards in the NBA. Who knows? The Wizards have actually made a handful of really good moves so far this offseason, so I want to stick with them for a little bit longer. I think it's pretty clear they're in rebuild mode, and they've acquired a fair bit of assets, even adding on more backcourt talent with Tyus Jones from the Memphis Grizzlies. Jones was one of the more underrated point guards in the entire league last season. I don't want to sound like I'm overrating the guy, but he was super efficient, scoring a bit over 10 points a night with 2.5 rebounds and 5 assists, along with less than a turnover while only seeing about 24 minutes of action a game. And if you're wondering why the Wizards signed these two young guards, my best guess is they don't have any real intentions of keeping them long term, but rather want to give them the opportunity to play in much larger roles so they can boost up their stock and then eventually ship them out for pieces when the team is closer to being in a position of being legitimately competitive again. Since there's no point talking about hypotheticals and what might maybe could happen in the future, let's look at the Wizards as they are with their current pieces. I mean, obviously they suck, but that's kind of the point, so they're actually doing great. And funny enough, they've been sort of a hub so far this offseason in which almost every traded player has either been sent to or from Washington, or the trade has involved Washington. It's landed them 6 second-round picks and 4 first-round pick swaps, and that's while already possessing one of the hottest free agents going into the summer, Kyle Kuzma. I don't have a lot to say on Kuzmania. I do think I'm a little higher on him than most are, but maybe I'm just falling for the bait of a 6'9" versatile wing again. Either way, in a free agency market that's not relatively deep, I think a versatile scorer who's as big as Clutch Kuz and who's actually fairly effective when it comes to defense will go for a decent chunk of change, at least more so than if it were a year with multiple free agents who are high-level wings. And all that's to say that the Wizards are in a pretty good position, not just for this offseason or going into free agency, but for the next few seasons in general. They also had the 7th overall pick in this year's draft, and Bilal Coulibaly is a pretty high upside guy with fairly low risk. The last 2 offseason moves we've seen so far that I want to talk about involve the Grizzlies and how Tyus Jones came to be traded to the Wizards, but I'll backtrack to that one in a second, and that's because I want to first talk about Kristaps Porzingis. Tingus Pingus is a Boston Celtic. What the Seriously, with a gun to my head and the power of a magic 8-ball, you couldn't have gotten me to predict that this was a move we would see, but I guess that says more about me, because why the hell not? It's the NBA. There are clearly some questions that need to be addressed. This isn't a perfect trade, and I'm far from being convinced that it'll work, but goddamn it, Boston, you have my attention. The first thing that needs to be stated is that we really need to start putting some respect on the 7'3" dude that averaged 23, 8, and almost 3 last season. Box score stats are never the full story, but sometimes given the context, they're enough to make certain claims, and the one I'm making is that it takes a ridiculous level of raw talent and ability to be as big as Porzingis is, but as offensively polished as he is. Now the problem comes when we turn towards the defensive end of the ball, where KP is pretty subpar. He's poor in isolation as you would imagine, the 7'3" giant isn't particularly laterally quick, who would have thought, but he's also not a great post-up defender, especially considering his size. He was fairly decent at defending the pick and roll, however, and regardless of his abilities, his height and length will naturally serve as somewhat of a deterrent and rim protection. Offensively though, is where the possibilities seem limitless. I'm not going to go over everything, but the biggest reason Porzingis' addition could be next level for the Celtics is because Tatum and Brown haven't really had a consistent high-volume scorer that can legitimately take the defense's pressure off them. The Celtics didn't have another genuine offensive threat that required defensive tensions to the point where either of them were given extra space. Overall, the mentality of, hey, we're going to make guys like Al Horford or Grant Williams cook us, and if they do, we'll just live with it, was an actionable game plan against the Celtics. With Tingus, however, that isn't the case. He's proficient enough from basically all levels to knock down open shots, but more than that, the hopes are that Kristaps will add a dimension to the Celtics' offense that involves post-offense and post-creation. This will provide not just Tatum and Brown, but the entire team the ability to move around the perimeter collecting good looks from kick-out passes. Porzingis can also serve as a facilitator for back-cut actions, and his scoring gravity extends to the elbows and free throw line, so we'll be seeing a variety of handoff actions. And lastly, the Porzingis-Tatum pick and roll will most likely be extremely deadly, so defenses are going to have their hands full. I'm hesitant to call this like a super amazing trade, one where everyone kind of goes, how the hell did you let this happen? But the ceiling is incredibly high, and as a fan of Kristaps, I'm really excited to see him take part in high-level basketball with a serious championship contender. Thankfully for the Celtics, Brad Stevens is an omniscient cosmic being who can see the future, and he made the decision, so I'm sure everything will work out. Unfortunately, the cost of this deal was one of the Celtics' most valuable pieces, and it was a trade that I'm sure was bittersweet to make. Marcus Smart is no longer a Boston Celtic. The Celtics are a little different because instead of rebuilding, they've been knocking on the door of a championship for the past few years, but even so, it's really tough to watch a player who truly devoted themselves to the culture of a team and their fans get traded away as one of the final steps in that team's path towards fighting for a title, and there is no one who embraced being a Boston Celtic more than Marcus Smart. I really thought his significance became even more noticeable when the Celtics played awful during this year's playoffs because they so quickly became disengaged and uninterested in playing when they felt they were already beat. But you could always count on Marcus Smart to give it his all and use his energy to bring back up his teammates. For all these reasons and more, losing Marcus Smart is devastating for the Celtics. As for why his departure could be a good thing, there are a few reasons that come to mind. For one, Marcus Smart is not a good three-point shooter. He shot the third most on the Celtics, but did so shooting around 33%. And I've talked about it more than once, but Boston is one of the highest volume three-point shooting teams, and due to their lack of offensive creativity, they often lived and died by it. And having a below league average three-point shooter chucking up more shots than everyone else but your two stars is not a recipe for fixing that issue. Additionally, Marcus Smart isn't really what he once was defensively, so his absence won't be this black hole-sized void on that end. And it's also not like he was a traditional point guard, so Tatum and Brown aren't losing like a crutch as far as being a ball handler and a floor general goes. Now, the last couple of things I'll say about this trade pertain to Porzingis again. His addition is a leap of faith by the Celtics front office that Jason Tatum and Jaylen Brown will be better than they were. Neither of them are incredible ball handlers, and KP isn't making that any better. I felt fairly confident that Boston shouldn't trade away Jaylen even with his downsides, considering the rarity of having two wings like him and Tatum at the level they are, but they undeniably needed someone who could shoulder some of the ball handling responsibilities, and a lot of people pleaded that what they needed was a true point guard in order to flourish. So there's clearly a level of trust that both of them will become smarter and more consistent when it comes to handling the ball, initiating offense, and becoming more vocal leaders. As for Marcus Smart on the Grizzlies, I actually really like it. I like that Memphis is getting an experienced NBA player. I don't know if he qualifies for vet status quite yet, but either way, someone who has experienced the finals and what it's like playing in a big market with all the drama and publicity that comes with it. I think he'll immediately become one of the more vocal players and a leader, so I'm interested to see if that in general raises the floor for this team. As a Grizzlies fan, you'd probably hope that he brought some shooting with him, but he's got the grit and hustle that they love, and I have no doubt that he'll come ready to compete. I don't believe this pushes them into being a legitimate contender, but I do think he's going to get everyone to play better, which is one of, if not the best thing a teammate can do. It's a good culture fit as well, so in general, I expect the Grizzlies to be a more competent team than they were last season, if that says anything. Alright, we've reached the conclusion of this very long-winded video. Thank you all so much for Oh wait, shit, the Hawks traded John Collins to the Jazz for Rudy Gay and some picks. Anyways. Thank you all so much for watching. I'm sorry again that I've been on such a long hiatus from making videos. Some of it was intentional, some of it wasn't, but oh well. I'm here now and I'm excited to be talking hoops again with all of you. I've got so much content planned for the summer and lots of things to talk about to suffice the NBA drought we'll all be in. In the meantime, go watch the WNBA. There's world-class hoops almost every night from now through September, and you're just a jabroni if you don't support women's sports. Me personally, I'll be cheering on my New York Liberty super team as we feast on the rest of the league on the way to our first championship in franchise history. Okay, that's enough from me. Enjoy, July, I guess. I'll be back soon, but until then, take care.